In 1840, 1 out of every 8 banking dollars in the United States sat in New Orleans. Not New York, not Philadelphia. New Orleans, a city that had been a malarial swamp camp just 120 years earlier, a place the French government had to populate with convicts and prostitutes because nobody in their right mind wanted to live there. And by 1860, 3,500 vessels a year were steaming in and out of its port, carrying $220 million worth of cargo, most of it cotton, bound for Liverpool. That figure, adjusted, lands somewhere north of $6.5 billion in today's money. This was not a regional city. This was one of the commercial capitals of the Western world, and the street where much of that wealth announced itself, where it dressed up, showed off, and spent freely, was Canal Street, 171 feet wide, named for a waterway that was never built. The founding story of New Orleans is essentially a confidence trick. In 1699, a 19-year-old French-Canadian named Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville was paddling down the Mississippi in 2 canoes with 5 men when he encountered an English warship, the Carolina Galley, bristling with 10 cannons and loaded with settlers looking for a place to land. Bienville paddled over and lied. He told the English captain that the territory was already claimed by France, that fortifications had been built, and that the French were prepared to defend it. None of this was true. The captain, a man named Louis Bond, who had previously been imprisoned by Bienville's brother in Hudson Bay, believed him and turned his ship around. That bend in the river is still called English Turn. 19 years later, in 1718, Bienville returned with 43 men and instructions from the Company of the West to establish a settlement 30 leagues up the river. He chose a crescent of slightly elevated ground accessible from both the Mississippi and a portage to Bayou St. John and Lake Pontchartrain. He named the place La Nouvelle Orléans, flattering Philippe, the Duke of Orléans, France's regent, whose support made the whole venture possible. The city that would become one of the wealthiest in North America was born from a bluff and a bit of political flattery on a piece of ground nobody else wanted. The first years were miserable. A census taken in November 1721 counted just 470 people, 277 whites and 172 black and 21 Indian slaves. The main crops in the vicinity were tobacco and indigo for export, rice and vegetables for local consumption. French ships were reluctant to call at New Orleans because the value of the cargo didn't justify the trip. In 1722, New Orleans was designated the capital of Louisiana, which was less a vote of confidence than an admission that nowhere else in the colony was any better. The Ursuline Convent, completed around 1752, still stands today, the oldest and finest French colonial building in the United States, and a reminder that the nuns who ran it were among the few early colonists who actually wanted to be there. In 1762, France, weary of its unprofitable colony, secretly ceded Louisiana to Spain. Spain held it for nearly 4 decades, rebuilding much of the city after devastating fires in 1788 and 1794. The cast-iron balconies and stuccoed facades that tourists now associate with the French Quarter are largely Spanish in origin, one of the city's enduring ironies. For its first 80 years, New Orleans changed hands like a card in a poker game. France gave it to Spain in 1762. Spain gave it back to France in 1800. And in 1803, Napoleon, strapped for cash after a disastrous military campaign in Haiti where yellow fever had decimated his army, sold the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. Thomas Jefferson had only authorized his diplomats to spend $10 million, and only for New Orleans itself. When the French offered everything from the Mississippi to the Rockies, 827,000 square miles, for just $5 million more, the Americans couldn't sign fast enough. The final transfer ceremony took place at the Cabildo on Jackson Square in December 1803. The population of New Orleans at the time was roughly 8,000, 4,000 whites, 2,700 enslaved people, and about 1,300 free people of color. Its exports that year were valued at just under $2 million. Within 4 decades, that number would be unrecognizable. What happened next was the Mississippi River. Or rather, what happened was that Americans figured out what the Mississippi River was worth. Every bushel of grain, every bale of cotton, every barrel of sugar produced anywhere in the vast interior of the continent From Pittsburgh to St. Louis to Memphis had to come downriver to reach the sea, and New Orleans sat at the bottom of the funnel. The introduction of the steamboat accelerated everything. In 1817, only 17 steamboats plied the western rivers. By 1837, there were over 700. The city's population kept pace. It roughly doubled every decade between 1810 and 1840. By 1840, New Orleans was the third largest city in the country, behind only New York and Baltimore, and it was growing faster than either. The cotton trade alone was staggering. More than half of all cotton grown in the United States passed through New Orleans. In the early 1850s, the city shipped more than double the cotton to Europe than Mobile, its nearest competitor. The stuff was everywhere. Bales stacked along the levee, piled in warehouses, loaded onto ships bound for Manchester and Liverpool. Cotton made up over 80% of the city's exports to foreign countries. And those exports made New Orleans the fourth largest port in the world, trailing only London, Liverpool, and New York. The scene along the levee in those years defied easy description. An 1884 print called The Levee, New Orleans, shows what amounted to a wall of cotton bales stretching as far as the eye could follow, with ships moored 3 and 4 deep and gangs of laborers loading cargo under the Louisiana sun. In 1835, a writer named Joseph Holt Ingram visited and declared that New Orleans represented every other city and nation upon earth. He said he knew of no place where so great a variety of the human species was congregated. He was not exaggerating. German and Irish immigrants arrived in enormous numbers in the 1840s, swelling the population to 116,375 by the 1850 census. The city had not yet learned to manage the health hazards of this growth. Drinking water came from the river or cisterns. There was no sewerage system. Drainage was atrocious, and flooding followed every heavy rain. Yellow fever epidemics killed thousands. In the summer of 1853 alone, roughly 8,000 people died. The city buried them and kept building. There was also the slave trade, which was inseparable from the cotton and sugar wealth. New Orleans operated the largest slave market in the United States. More than 50 markets ran in the city between the 1830s and the Civil War, through which an estimated 750,000 enslaved people were bought and sold. The commerce in human beings functioned as an industry in its own right, with its own brokers, holding pens, and supply chains running from Virginia and Maryland south to the plantations. By 1860, 7% of the city's population was enslaved, held by some of the 22,000 slave owners across Louisiana. The wealth that built the mansions of the Garden District, the wealth that filled the coffers of the banks on Canal Street, a substantial portion of it was generated by the buying and selling of people. But cotton was only part of the commodity story. Sugar was the other fortune. Louisiana planters, many of them working land along the River Road between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, produced nearly all the sugar in the country. A typical Louisiana sugar plantation was valued at around $200,000 and yielded a 10% annual return, numbers that made it the most expensive type of farm in America and among the most profitable. The wealth concentrated along that stretch of river was extraordinary. In the mid-1800s, the highest concentration of millionaires in America could be found between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And all of that money, cotton money, sugar money, slave trading money, shipping money, banking money, flowed into the city and expressed itself in buildings. Canal Street was the seam. On one side sat the old French Quarter, the Vieux Carré, home to the Creole families of French and Spanish descent. On the other side stretched the new American sector, the Faubourg Sainte-Marie, where the Anglo merchants and speculators arriving after the Louisiana Purchase set up shop. The two groups didn't much care for each other. The wide strip of open land between them, the old commons, became Canal Street, a neutral ground. That term, neutral ground, still means median in New Orleans today, and it was on this contested strip that both sides competed to build the most impressive commercial corridor in the South. By the mid-1880s, Canal Street was one of the first streets in the world lit by electric lights, joining London, Paris, and New York. It was 171 feet wide, traversed by streetcars, and already home to the dry goods emporia that would define it for the next century. The Civil War nearly killed the whole enterprise. The Union Navy captured New Orleans in April 1862, barely a year into the conflict, making it the first major Confederate city to fall. The occupation, under the command of Major General Benjamin Butler, a man the locals came to despise so thoroughly they nicknamed him Beast, choked off the cotton trade that had been the city's lifeblood. The port, which had thrummed with 3,500 vessels a year, went quiet. The banks that had held 12% of the nation's capital watched their assets evaporate as Confederate currency became worthless and the plantation economy collapsed. The war cost New Orleans its position as the undisputed commercial capital of the South. It would never fully reclaim it. Before the war, the city had been the largest in the Confederacy and the 5th largest in the nation. Afterward, it began a long, slow slide down the rankings. Between 1850 and 1900, New Orleans fell from 5th to 12th place in the national urban hierarchy, passed by cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Detroit, industrial cities that were building factories while New Orleans was still, fundamentally, a city that moved other people's goods from one vessel to another. But the city rebuilt, as it always did. The port recovered. Sicilian immigrants arrived in waves in the late 1800s, joining the Germans and Irish who had come a generation earlier. By 1910, Sicilian migrants and their descendants made up nearly 40% of the state's foreign-born population. They took the jobs at the bottom of the labor market, the dock work, the produce hauling, the fishing, and built a community that would leave its mark on the city's food, its neighborhoods, and its particular brand of Catholicism. The French Quarter, which had been the prestigious address of the Creole elite before the war, began to decline in the late 1800s as wealthier families moved uptown. Artists and bohemians moved in. Rents dropped. The old buildings, with their cast-iron balconies and interior courtyards, survived partly because nobody had enough money to tear them down and build something new. Preservation by neglect, some historians call it. It would turn out to be one of the luckiest accidents in the history of American architecture. Daniel Henry Holmes, an Ohio native, opened a small dry goods store on Chartres Street in 1842. He was a direct importer of textiles, fine silks for evening gowns at one end of the price range, rough cloth for the clothing of enslaved people at the other. In 1849, he moved to a larger building on Canal Street, decorated in what was described as an elaborate English Tudor Gothic style. To enter it, one writer noted, was like walking into a cathedral of merchandising. By the turn of the 20th century, D.H. Holmes occupied the entire 800 block of Canal and was the largest department store in the South. It had a restaurant called the Potpourri, departments for everything from women's fashions to furniture and Christmas decorations so elaborate that families dressed in their finest, hats, gloves, the works, just to come see them. A few blocks away, at the corner of Canal and Dauphine, Maison Blanche opened on October 30th, 1897. The name meant White House, a nod to the white exterior of the original 5-story building. It was financed in part by Isidore Newman, a banker whose name still graces one of the city's most prominent private schools. The original building had 60,000 square feet of sales space, 2 elevators, and departments for everything from jewelry to upholstery. Within a decade, the owners tore it down and built something bigger, a 13-story building, the largest in the city at the time, with the store occupying the first 5 floors and medical offices above. Maison Blanche became famous for Mr. Bingle, a snowman character created by display manager Emile Aline in 1947, who became the unofficial mascot of Christmas in New Orleans. Crowds gathered at the store's windows every holiday season, sometimes so thick that police were needed for crowd control. And then there was the Grunewald. Louis Grunewald was not a hotelier by trade. He was a music merchant, a German immigrant from the Rhineland-Palatinate who arrived in New Orleans in 1852 to teach piano and play organ at the Catholic churches of the Lower Garden District. He opened a small music store on Magazine Street in 1856, then built Grunewald Hall, a concert venue on Baronne Street. In 1893, he opened the Hotel Grunewald on the same block, 6 stories, 200 rooms. It was a respectable hotel, but it was what came next that made it legendary. In 1908, Grunewald's heirs erected a 14-story, 400-room annex designed by the Milwaukee firm of H.C. Koch & Sons. The new tower featured a facade trimmed with Renaissance-inspired terracotta panels, floral motifs, garlands, cartouches. But the real draw was underground. In the basement, the hotel opened the Cave, a subterranean supper club decorated with artificial stalactites, stalagmites, waterfalls, and glass-topped tables, where a line of chorus girls danced to a Dixieland jazz band. Historians generally credit the cave as one of America's first nightclubs. It remained in operation until around 1930. Remember the name Grunewald, because the hotel's story tracks the story of the city. In 1923, Theodore Grunewald, Louis's son, sold the hotel to a group of investors led by the Vaccaro brothers, Joseph, Felix, and Luca. The new owners spent $500,000 on renovations and renamed it the Roosevelt Hotel in honor of Theodore Roosevelt, whose Panama Canal project had been a windfall for New Orleans' port economy. They demolished the original Grunewald building and built a 16-story tower in its place. By the end of 1925, the hotel had a block-long lobby gilded enough to make visitors stop in the doorway, a barber shop, a coffee shop, and a tradition of Christmas decorations that continues to this day. The old Romanesque room became the Blue Room, and on New Year's Eve, 1935, the Blue Room began hosting live music. Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Sammy Kaye, Guy Lombardo. It became the premier music venue in the city. The man who ran the Roosevelt for more than 30 years was Seymour Weiss, who had started his career there as the barbershop manager and climbed to general manager, then vice president, then owner. Weiss was a close friend and political confidant of Huey Long, the governor and later senator who used a 12th floor suite at the Roosevelt as his unofficial state headquarters whenever he was in New Orleans. Long intended to challenge Franklin Roosevelt for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1936. He was assassinated in Baton Rouge in September 1935. The suite stayed. While the Roosevelt thrummed with politics and big band music, something else was happening just a few blocks away. Something that would become New Orleans' most enduring cultural export. In a 38-block zone behind the French Quarter, bounded by Basin Street, Iberville, Robertson, and St. Louis, the city had created in 1897 a legal red light district. It was the work of Alderman Sidney Story, who wrote the legislation to contain, though not prohibit, prostitution. The locals named the district Storyville after him, as a joke. He did not appreciate it, but Storyville was not just about vice. Where there were bordellos and saloons operating around the clock, there was a demand for music, and that demand created employment for black and Creole musicians at a scale that existed nowhere else in the country. The roots went deeper, back to Congo Square, where enslaved people had been permitted to gather on Sundays to drum, dance, and trade, an arrangement almost unheard of in the American South. That tradition preserved West African rhythmic patterns that would prove essential. Add the European classical training that many Creole musicians received, the brass band tradition from military parades and funeral processions, the blues carried in by rural guitarists, and ragtime drifting down from St. Louis. And you had a city where more distinct musical traditions coexisted in closer proximity than perhaps anywhere on earth. Around 1895, a cornet player named Charles Buddy Bolden assembled a band and began playing a style no one had quite heard before, looser than ragtime, rougher, more improvised, with a blues feel and a power that witnesses said could be heard blocks away. Nobody recorded Bolden. He was committed to a mental institution in 1907 and spent the rest of his life there. But the musicians who heard him, Freddie Keppard, Joe King Oliver, Kid Ory, Jelly Roll Morton, carried what he started into the saloons and dance halls, and eventually out of New Orleans altogether. When the Navy shut Storyville down in November 1917, worried about its effect on military personnel, many of those musicians followed the Great Migration north, to Chicago, to New York, to Kansas City, and brought the music with them. New Orleans invented jazz, and then, in a sense, the federal government shipped it out. On February 4, 1927, the Saenger Theater opened on Canal Street, and the city threw itself a parade. The building had taken 3 years to construct and cost $2.5 million, somewhere around $46 million in today's money. Julian Saenger, who with his brother Abe had built a chain of theaters across the South, commissioned architect Emile Weil to design the interior as an atmospheric theater meant to recall an Italian Baroque courtyard. Weil installed 150 lights in the ceiling, arranged in the shapes of constellations, and used special effects machines to project moving clouds, sunrises, and sunsets across the artificial sky. The theater seated 4,000. The ticket price was 65 cents. Each performance included a silent movie, a live stage play produced by Paramount Publix, and music from the Saenger Grand Orchestra, amplified through a 2,000-pipe Robert Morton organ, the largest instrument the company had ever built, designed specifically for the room's acoustics. 2 years later, Julian Saenger sold the theater to Paramount Publix for $10 million in stock. Within a few years, that stock was worthless. The crash wiped out the Saenger family, but Canal Street kept going. Through the Depression, through the war, the department stores stayed open, the streetcars ran, the Roosevelt lobby sparkled at Christmas. In 1922, the year New Orleans Public Service Incorporated consolidated the city's streetcar operations. The system covered more than 225 miles of track and carried 148 million riders a year. Think about that number. A city of fewer than 400,000 people generated 148 million streetcar rides in a single year. The Roaring Twenties was the peak of the system. Routes radiated into every neighborhood, including the newly built lines to the 9th Ward along the Industrial Canal. The St. Charles Avenue line, which had been running continuously since the 1830s, rolled under a canopy of live oaks, past Loyola and Tulane universities, past Audubon Park, past the antebellum mansions of the Garden District. It remains the oldest continuously operating streetcar line in the world. The dark green pearly A. Thomas cars that run on it today, swaying on their mahogany seats, were built in the late 1920s. In 1949, Seymour Weiss bought the rights to the name Sazerac Bar from the Sazerac Company, renovated a storefront on Baronne Street, and opened a bar that abolished the old men-only rule. He admitted women, and the bar thrived. The Sazerac cocktail, rye whiskey, Peychaud's bitters, a rinse of absinthe, had been mixed in New Orleans since the 1850s, but Weiss understood that giving it a proper room, in a proper hotel with proper service, was good business. Around the same time, Arthur Haley checked into the Roosevelt for a 2-month stay. He watched the staff, took copious notes, studied the economics of running a grand independent hotel in a changing market. His observations became the basis of his 1965 novel Hotel, which employees later said they could read like a Roman à clay. They recognized themselves in the characters, the rooms in the descriptions, the financial anxieties in the plot. Meanwhile, Vivian Leigh arrived in New Orleans in October 1950 to film exterior scenes for A Streetcar Named Desire. She stayed at the Roosevelt, posed in her suite, and pronounced it fine, just like I left in Hollywood. Eddie Fisher brought his family through, wife Debbie Reynolds, young daughter Carrie, and posed in the lobby. The hotel's guest list read like a cross-section of mid-century American fame: Elvis Presley, Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, Ray Charles, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, Frank Sinatra. The Blue Room was where you played if you were anyone, and where you went to listen if you had the price of a drink and a decent suit. On any given Saturday in the 1940s or early 1950s, Canal Street was one of the great urban scenes in the American South. Women in hats and gloves stepping between D.H. Holmes and Maison Blanche and Godshow's and Krauss, the streetcars clanging past the neon signs, the Saenger marquee lit up for the evening show. A woman named Judy Rabouin Tarantino, who grew up in the Gentilly neighborhood, recalled that her mother always made sure she and her sister wore hats and gloves and stockings when they went downtown to have lunch with their grandmother at the D.H. Holmes lunch counter. Meyer the Hatter, which had opened in 1894, still sold hats at the same Canal Street address it had always occupied. Rubenstein's, the men's clothier, had been there since 1924. These were not chain stores. They were family businesses that knew their customers by name and had dressed their grandparents. The city's population peaked in 1960 at 627,525. That is the number that everything since has been measured against. New Orleans was the 15th largest city in the country. It had the Roosevelt, the Saenger, a functioning port, an oil industry that was beginning to boom, the best food in America, music pouring out of every door in the French Quarter, and Mardi Gras, which drew visitors from around the world. On Bourbon Street, the strip joints and jazz clubs operated elbow to elbow, and the smells of red beans and rice drifted out of neighborhood restaurants in every direction. The old French market still sold produce at dawn. Antoine's, the oldest family-run restaurant in the country, had been serving oysters Rockefeller since 1899, a dish invented there, in fact, and named for the richest man the chef could think of. Commander's Palace, Galatoire's, Brennan's, these were not tourist restaurants, but places where New Orleans families celebrated and conspired and closed deals over long lunches that bled into the afternoon. But that peak number conceals what was already happening underneath. By 1950, Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta had already surpassed New Orleans in population. The cotton trade that had built the city's fortune was long past. The sugar industry had contracted. The port was still important, but no longer dominant the way it had been when the river was the only way to move goods out of the interior. Railroads had changed that equation decades earlier, and now highways were changing it again. The agro-export economy that had made New Orleans rich required relatively few urban laborers compared to the factories of the industrial North. Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit. Those cities were building things. New Orleans was still, at its core, a middleman city, and the world was finding ways to cut out the middleman. And then came the Interstate. In the late 1960s, the federal government offered to cover 90% of the cost of urban freeway construction, and New Orleans took the deal. Interstate 10 was built as an elevated expressway directly above Claiborne Avenue, through the heart of the Treme neighborhood, the oldest African-American neighborhood in the country, a place where jazz had been born in the dance halls and where, before the bulldozers came on Ash Wednesday 1966, the wide neutral ground had been lined with live oak trees under which families picnicked, socialized, and shopped at the corridor's thriving black-owned businesses. There was a grocery store, a linen shop, a hardware store, restaurants, pharmacies, a movie theater, the Circle Food Store, New Orleans' first African-American-owned full-service grocery, which had opened in 1938. The construction of the expressway destroyed 500 homes and uprooted the oaks. In the decade that followed, registered businesses along Claiborne Avenue dropped by 50%. The neighborhood never recovered. Robert Moses, emboldened, proposed running another expressway along the riverfront through the French Quarter itself. Preservationists fought that one and won, but the damage to Treme was done. The 1970s brought oil money. A booming petroleum industry drove the construction of more than a dozen corporate office towers along Poydras Street, transforming the downtown skyline into something that looked like a miniature Houston. Running just 1.2 miles from old riverfront warehouses to the still new Interstate 10 over Claiborne Avenue, Poydras became the most dramatic physical manifestation of the decade's ambitions. International-style glass towers rose one after another, headquarters for oil companies, engineering firms, law offices that serviced the energy sector. The transformation happened quickly. It would stop almost as abruptly. But in the mid-70s, with oil at record prices and money pouring into the state, New Orleans felt like a city that had found its second act. The Louisiana Superdome, the largest fixed-dome stadium in the world, opened on August 3, 1975. It had been projected to cost $46 million. By the time it was finished, delays and the 1973 oil crisis had pushed the final price to $165 million. The architect was Nathaniel Buster Curtis, Jr. of the New Orleans firm Curtis & Davis. At the opening ceremony, a crowd of 40,000 heard Lieutenant Governor Jimmy Fitzmaurice call Dave Dixon, the dome's chief promoter, a man who dreamed the impossible dream. The Saints played their first game there and lost. They would lose a great many more, but the Superdome became a symbol of civic ambition, of the oil-fueled confidence of the 70s, and eventually of something much darker. Because the oil money left. In the mid-1980s, a global supply glut sent crude prices plummeting, and the regional economy, which had bet nearly everything on petroleum, collapsed. More than 60,000 workers lost their jobs. The gleaming towers along Poydras Street emptied out. Basing an entire regional economy on a single commodity has always been a risky endeavor. New Orleans had learned this once before with cotton, a century earlier, but the lesson apparently hadn't taken. Between the peak of the oil boom in 1981 and the bottom of the bust in 1987, the metro area lost 10% of its jobs. Between 1960 and 1980, the city's population had already fallen by 21%, driven by suburbanization and white flight to Jefferson Parish and St. Tammany. The oil bust accelerated the decline and added a new ingredient: poverty. By the early 1990s, New Orleans had one of the highest murder rates in the country, fueled in part by the crack epidemic, and a poverty rate nearly double the national average. On the eve of Katrina in 2005, nearly a quarter of the city's residents lived below the poverty line, compared to 13% for the nation. The median household income was $30,000, $16,000 below the national figure. The white power structure, critics charged, focused its energy on maintaining the tourist economy, the Super Bowl, Mardi Gras, the Jazz Festival, while the neighborhoods rotted. The department stores went one by one. D.H. Holmes, which by 1989 had 18 locations across the South, was purchased by Dillard's that year. The Canal Street flagship became a hotel. Today it's the Hyatt-centric French Quarter. Maison Blanche held on until 1998, when Dillard's absorbed it too. Mr. Bingle went with the deal. Dillard's still uses him for holiday merchandise. The Canal Street building became the Ritz-Carlton. Godshow's was already gone. Krauss closed in 1997. The Saturday shopping ritual, the hats, the gloves, the lunch counter, belonged to a world that no longer existed. Canal Street filled with T-shirt shops and hot sauce emporiums aimed at tourists. The Roosevelt became the Fairmont in 1965 when the Swig family of San Francisco bought it. The initial renovations cost $1.5 million, mostly cosmetic: the blue room, the entrances, the dining rooms. Most locals never called it the Fairmont. Then Hurricane Katrina hit on August 29, 2005, and the hotel, along with the rest of the city, went dark. The levees broke, and 80% of the city flooded. Water rose 14 feet inside the Saenger Theater, filling the basement and the entire orchestra level. The Fairmont suffered extensive damage and closed indefinitely. Preliminary repair estimates turned out to be far too low, and in March 2007, repair work was suspended. The Superdome, which had sheltered more than 30,000 desperate people in conditions that horrified the nation, needed $193 million in repairs before it could reopen. It did reopen on September 25, 2006, for a Monday night football game against the Atlanta Falcons. U2 and Green Day performed before kickoff. Steve Gleason blocked a punt on the opening drive. The Saints won 23-3. The building that had symbolized the city's darkest hour became, briefly, a symbol of its refusal to quit. In 2007, Sam Friedman of Dimension Development bought the old Fairmont for $17 million, a fraction of what it had cost to build, even accounting for a century of inflation, and announced plans to spend $170 million restoring it as part of Hilton's Waldorf Astoria collection. The design paid homage to the hotel's 1930s and 1940s glory. It reopened on July 1, 2009, under its old name, the Roosevelt. The Saenger's restoration cost $53 million and took until September 2013. Jerry Seinfeld headlined the reopening. The organ still works. The streetcar on Canal Street had been shut down in 1964, replaced by buses. It didn't come back until 2004, 40 years later. The St. Charles line survived only because preservationists managed to get it designated a historic landmark before it could be ripped out. Katrina knocked even that line out of service, and it didn't fully resume until late 2007. Today, New Orleans operates 5 streetcar lines. The system carries about 10,000 riders on an average weekday. In 1922, it carried 148 million a year. The population numbers tell the quiet version of the story. The 1960 peak, 627,525. The 1970 census, 593,471. 1980, 557,515. 1990, 496,938. 2000, 484,674. Then Katrina displaced the entire population of the city, all 455,000 people. By July 2006, the Census Bureau estimated 223,000 residents. The city clawed back slowly. The 2020 census counted 383,997. The most recent estimate puts the number around 364,000. New Orleans is now the 53rd largest city in the country. In 1840, it was third. On Claiborne Avenue, where the live oaks once shaded families walking to the corner store, concrete pillars hold up 6 lanes of interstate traffic. Local artists have painted murals on the columns, images of the neighborhood's former life. The city's master plan, completed in 2009, called for removing the expressway. Architects have drawn up plans. The costs are enormous, the politics difficult. The expressway stands. The Roosevelt's block-long lobby still gets decorated for Christmas, and families still walk through it, though many of them are tourists now. The Blue Room hosts events. The Sazerac Bar serves cocktails named for the city's signature drink. Upstairs, somewhere around the 12th floor, there's a suite where a governor once ran a state. The building at 819 Canal Street, where D.H. Holmes sold silks and rough cloth and served lunch on white tablecloths, is a Hyatt. The building at 901 Canal, where Maison Blanche displayed Mr. Bingle in the window and a woman once wasn't allowed to try on a hat, is a Ritz-Carlton. The Saenger's ceiling still has its constellations, and on certain nights, before the lights go down, the projection machines send clouds drifting across the artificial sky, just as they did when the ticket cost 65 cents and thousands paraded down Canal Street to see a building open. On North Claiborne Avenue, beneath the Interstate, there is a traffic circle where the Circle food store used to stand. The store reopened after Katrina, closed again, reopened again. The oak trees have been gone for 60 years. Someone painted them on the concrete columns. Green canopies, thick trunks, the memory of shade on a street where shade no longer falls.